The last of the afternoon light slanted through the stained glass windows, filling the old church hallway with fractured color that barely warmed the air. Renovation dust floated in slow spirals. A single temporary flood lamp hummed faintly, casting a harsh white glow across the clutter left behind by workers who had gone home early. The building, usually alive with choir rehearsals and weekend potlucks, felt strangely hollow, as if it were holding its breath. Detective Rowan Hawley walked slowly toward the storage room the pastor had mentioned, his steps muffled by the tarp-covered floor. He wasn't expecting much. Cold cases rarely offered gifts after 30, 40 years. Yet there was something about the pastor's voice on the phone, something in the way the man said they were throwing out old office equipment, that wouldn't let Holly ignore it. He pushed open the storage room door, and the hinges gave a tired groan. Inside, the air was dense with the smell of cardboard, mildew, and time. Piles of outdated hymnals leaned precariously against stacks of labeled boxes. Old donation ledgers sat warped from moisture. And near the back, half buried beneath a collapsed stack of directories, was a beige computer tower, one of those boxy relics from the early 90s. Its casing was yellowed, its corners chipped. A thin layer of dust coated it like frost over forgotten ground. But Holly noticed what someone else might have missed. A small USB drive taped to the side, its label written in fading black ink. Choir Schedules 1993. He crouched, sweeping aside curled church bulletins and dried-up pens. When he lifted the tower, something inside rattled. It sounded brittle, like a memory shaking loose. He felt a flicker of recognition. He couldn't place something about small towns, familiar places, people who believed they knew each other. Behind him, Marla Kinsey stood in the doorway, watching without speaking. The man looked as though he wasn't sure whether to hope or brace for disappointment. For years he'd kept a quiet vigil, returning to every rumor, every scrap of possibility, every whisper that hinted at movement in a case the world had long given up on. Hawley carried the computer into the fading light of the hallway. Dust swirled around his boots, catching in the glow of the flood lamp. He examined the USB more closely. Its plastic felt smooth in his gloved hand, as if it had been handled often by someone who needed to hide something but keep it close. There was nothing unusual about a church office computer in a place like Havenwick. Nothing unusual about boxes of old bulletins. Nothing unusual about aging equipment bound for the dumpster. But sometimes the ordinary is exactly where the truth hides. Eli stepped closer. "Do you think it matters?" Hawley didn't answer right away. He had learned to trust instinct, and instinct rarely announced itself loudly. It crept up in moments like this, quiet, persistent, unsettling. "We won't know until we look," he finally said. He carried the computer out toward the crisp Nebraska evening, where the wind had picked up, rolling across the prairie in uneasy gusts. The sky had darkened into a band of blue-gray, and the temperature had dropped enough that breath turned faintly visible. The church behind them stood tall and solemn against the dimming horizon, its windows glowing with the last remnants of day. Hawley set the tower in the trunk of his vehicle. As he closed the lid, the flood lamp inside flickered once, then steadied. It felt like a breath exhaled. Eli lingered beside him. "If this is nothing, I can live with that. I've lived with nothing for most of my life." His voice tightened. "But if it's something, even a small thing, I just want to know." Hawley nodded. "We'll find out. Whatever's on this machine will speak once we give it the chance." The wind swept across the parking lot, carrying the dry scent of cut hay and the faint echo of distant freight trains. Hawley slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and drove toward Lincoln, leaving the church in the rearview mirror, its steeple shrinking against the wide, empty sky. Miles away, lights from grain elevators blinked like watchful eyes. The computer tower shifted slightly in the trunk as the car hit a patch of uneven asphalt. It was a small movement, barely noticeable. But for the first time in decades, something connected to the Parish Man case had moved. Something long silent had stirred. The road stretched forward, dark and indifferent. Holly pressed on. To understand how this began, we go back to 1986. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe now. It helps us bring more truth to light. Morning always arrived quietly for Marla Kinsey, slipping into her kitchen through the eastern window before she was fully awake. She liked the light here in Havenwick, the way it softened the edges of the prairie and made even the most ordinary moments feel worthwhile. She filled the kettle, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator and the rhythmic ticking of the clock above the dining table. Her home wasn't large, but it carried the warmth of someone who cared about every detail. The crocheted blanket draped over the couch, the framed photograph of her parents on their anniversary, the vase of dried wildflowers she had picked last summer along the Co-Road Trail. She ate her breakfast slowly: toast, apricot jam, coffee with a little sugar, while reviewing the day's tasks written on a small notepad she kept beside a bowl of keys. Her handwriting was neat, each letter rounded, each line properly spaced. She liked order, but not the rigid kind. Hers was an order born from habit and tenderness, the kind that made life feel manageable. By 7:30 she was walking toward the grain co-op, the morning air crisp enough to sting her cheeks. She greeted the mail carrier, waved at the bakery owner sweeping the sidewalk, and paused at the corner where the high school band practiced on fall mornings. She didn't know every student by name, but she recognized their faces. Havenwick was that kind of place. Inside the co-op, the scent of paper, dust, and coffee mingled with the faint earthy smell that clung to the clothes of farmers who stopped by to check their accounts. Marla's desk sat beside a tall window overlooking the grain elevators. She liked the view. She said it made her feel connected to something larger than numbers on spreadsheets. Her work was patient, methodical, balancing ledgers, updating shipment records, printing weekly summaries for the manager. If someone struggled with paperwork, she explained it gently. If someone forgot a form, she filled in what she could. Toward mid-morning, the older farmers began arriving, their boots leaving faint tracks on the worn office floor. They always called her kiddo, even though she was in her 30s, and she seemed to accept it with a smile that held equal parts affection and amusement. During lunch, she often sat on the bench behind the building, watching the freight trains pass. The rumble soothed her, reminding her how the world moved even beyond Havenwick's familiar borders. She sometimes imagined herself traveling somewhere new, nothing dramatic, just a simple trip to the Rockies or the Great Lakes. She wrote about such places in her journal, a small brown notebook she kept in her purse. She didn't talk about her dreams often, but they lived quietly in those pages. In the evenings, Marla walked to Christ Hope Fellowship for choir practice. She wasn't the strongest singer, but she had a steady, warm voice that blended well with others. She arrived early to help set out music folders and straighten chairs. The fellowship hall always carried a faint scent of lemon cleaner and old carpet, a smell that reminded her of childhood programs and Christmas plays. Members of the choir often leaned on her, sometimes literally, for everything from harmony questions to emotional burdens. She listened more than she spoke. People trusted her, not because she demanded it, but because she made space for them to feel heard. On Wednesdays, she helped fold bulletins in the office, chatting with whoever happened to be around. She liked being useful in small ways, and she took comfort in the rhythm of the church's weekly routine. If she ever suspected someone was watching her more closely than necessary, she never mentioned it. To her, the church felt like home. Her brother, Ela, visited her on weekends. They shared meals at the diner on Main Street, talking about their parents and their childhood summers spent at the county fair. Eli worried too much, she always told him. He had a way of looking at the world that suggested trouble was always a little closer than it appeared. She would laugh and remind him that people in Havenwick looked out for each other. The last week of her life unfolded quietly, without warning signs or unsettled moments. She worked her shifts, went to choir, wrote in her journal about the early frost on the fields. On Friday evening, she called Eli to check on him. He'd spent the day repairing a friend's tractor and sounded tired. She teased him for taking on too much, then softened her tone when he sighed. She didn't like to hang up the phone if he sounded worn down. "You're okay, right?" he asked her. "You sound a little distracted. Just thinking about tomorrow's errands," she said. That's all. It wasn't the full truth. She'd felt a prickle of unease the last few days, a hunch she couldn't explain. A few times she thought she heard footsteps behind her when she walked home, but when she turned, the street was empty. The wind played strange tricks at sunset, carrying echoes from the grain elevators or the creaking of porch steps. Still, she dismissed it. Havenwick wasn't the kind of place where danger lived in the open. She trusted the routine she'd built, the familiar faces that filled her days, the sanctity of the choir loft, the quiet hum of co-op ledgers. She trusted the rhythm of her life, believing it would carry her safely into the coming week. On the final night, she placed her folded church bulletin on the table near the door, the same place she always left it so she wouldn't forget it on Sunday. The edges of the paper curled slightly. Her handwriting filled the margins, notes about hymn order and a reminder to rehearse a difficult harmony one more time. She dimmed the lights, locked the door, and took one last look at her home, unaware that this simple ritual would become a memory others revisited for decades. She didn't know that the person who noticed her routines most closely wasn't someone she confided in, but someone who watched her quietly from within the same spaces she cherished. She closed the door gently, believing she'd see tomorrow as she always had. She never did. The last full day of Marla Kinsey's life began with the same quiet rhythm she had followed for years, and nothing in those hours suggested how sharply the pattern would break. Saturday in Havenwick always moved slowly, marked by early grocery runs, small-town errands, and the hum of freight trains rolling east. Marla spent the morning cleaning her kitchen, wiping down the countertops, and setting aside a grocery list she planned to fill after lunch. She walked to the farmer's market near the grain elevators, buying apples and a bundle of late-season chrysanthemums. She greeted neighbors with the same warm patience she always carried, unaware that someone else was watching her movements with far greater attention. Around midday, she returned home and placed the groceries neatly in her pantry. Her house felt peaceful, a kind of lived-in calm shaped by the scent of lemon soap and the gentle creak of aging floorboards. She sat for a moment in her living room, opening her journal to jot down a note about an upcoming choir rehearsal. There was nothing unusual in her handwriting, nothing urgent in her thoughts. She folded the church bulletin beside her and rehearsed the next day's hymn under her breath. Then she closed the notebook and prepared for the rest of her afternoon. Shortly before 3, she walked toward the co-op to drop off a stack of updated ledgers she had brought home for weekend balancing. The air was unseasonably warm, the kind of late autumn day that felt borrowed from another season. The sidewalks were mostly empty. A few residents raked leaves into piles, and a lone dog barked from behind a fence. Marla passed the church on her way, glancing at the bulletin board to see if any announcements had been added. None had. She reached the co-op office, placed the ledgers on her desk, and made a note to finalize a shipment report on Monday. She turned off the small desk lamp she always kept on low brightness, then locked the door behind her. As she walked home, the shadows lengthened across the street. A pickup she didn't recognize slowed slightly as it passed her, but cars often did that on quiet Havenwick roads. She didn't think twice about it. By evening, the temperature had dropped, and the wind carried the faint, sharp scent of harvested cornfields. Marla prepared a simple dinner, chicken soup and crackers, while listening to the radio. A sermon replayed from earlier that week drifted through the speakers. She lowered the volume, humming the choir harmony she had been practicing. When she finished her meal, she cleaned her dishes carefully, drying each one and nesting them back into the cupboard. Her last phone call came just after 8. It was Eli checking in, as he usually did on weekends. Their conversation was brief, gentle, the way siblings speak when nothing is wrong, but neither wants to end the call too soon. She told him about the early frost on the hydrangeas and asked whether he needed help sorting their parents' old boxes. He teased her about working too much. She promised she'd rest tomorrow. When she hung up, she placed the church bulletin on the small table near the door, the same table she always used whenever something needed to be remembered for morning service. The paper curled slightly at the corners. Light from a street lamp outside pushed a faint glow across the living room floor. Around 9:30, a neighbor walking his dog noticed Marla's porch light flicker on and off. It wasn't unusual. The bulb had been temperamental for weeks. He didn't stop to check it. He passed by with a quiet greeting thrown toward the house, assuming she was inside preparing for bed. Sometime between 9:40 and 10:15, everything changed. Investigators later reconstructed the sequence from a mixture of incomplete evidence, neighbor recollections, and the pattern that would emerge across multiple Parish Man victims. The offender knew Marla's routines well. When she returned from errands, when she dimmed her lights, when she set the bulletin by the door. He likely approached from the alley that ran behind the co-op and her street, a narrow lane bordered by garages and tool sheds. No one remembered hearing anything unusual. The wind was strong that night, rustling the gutters and shaking the loose siding on older homes. Forensic examination years later suggested that the killer entered through the back door, exploiting the older latch that sometimes stuck on cold nights. There were faint scratches near the locking mechanism, subtle enough to escape notice unless someone knew exactly what to look for. Inside the house, nothing appeared dramatically disturbed at first glance. There was no overturned furniture, no shattered glass, no sign of forced confrontation. Only small details spoke to what had happened: the slightly askew rug, the chair not fully pushed in, the hymn sheet on the floor with a faint crease across its center. In the hallway leading toward her bedroom, investigators found the first definitive clue that pointed to a struggle. The table against the wall had shifted a few inches, leaving a thin line of dust where it once sat. A candle that usually rested on top had rolled to the far corner, unbroken but displaced. The position of those objects suggested brief resistance, quick, quiet, and controlled. There were rope fibers on the carpet, barely visible unless illuminated at the right angle. They matched fibers found in later cases but were indistinguishable at the time, too faint and common to raise alarms. What stood out most, however, was something that did not belong: a sheet of folded paper beneath a chair near the doorway. It was not one of Marla's bulletins. It was blank but carried a faint scent of church attic dust, older than anything she would have had reason to handle. The next morning, when Marla failed to arrive at the co-op for her early shift, her absence was noticed almost immediately. She was dependable, never late, and always the first to unlock the office. At 7:15, her coworker Linda called her home phone. The rings echoed unanswered. By 8:30, concern had grown into unease. Linda drove to Marla's house, expecting to find her sick or having overslept. She knocked several times, calling her name. No sound came from inside. The porch light, still flickering, cast a weak pattern across the siding. Through the front window, she could see nothing out of place. She tried the doorknob, locked. Linda stepped back, wondering what to do. She walked to the neighbor's house and explained the situation. The neighbor, the same man who had seen the flickering light the night before, offered to check around back. When he reached the rear door, he felt the same chill of intuition that had once saved him on icy farm roads. The doorknob turned easily. The latch was misaligned, as if it hadn't fully caught. He called out again. No answer. Inside the kitchen, the air felt still. The soup pot from the night before was washed and drying in the rack. The chair at the small dining table sat slightly angled. There was nothing immediately alarming, but something felt wrong. The neighbor stepped farther inside, each creak of the floorboards tightening his chest. He called for Marla again. He reached the hallway and saw the displaced table and the candle on the floor. A tension rose in the room, silent but heavy, as if the house itself registered the intrusion of dread. He noticed the fibers on the carpet and bent closer, not understanding what he was seeing but sensing their significance. When he turned the corner toward the bedroom, everything in his body told him to stop. He stepped back, heart pounding, and ran outside to call for help. When officers arrived, the discovery itself was brief. The crime scene was preserved with care, but the emotional shock rippled through Havenwick as soon as word spread. The co-op closed early. The church doors were locked for the day. People gathered on porches, waiting for news they did not want to hear. Inside Marla's home, investigators noted every detail, no matter how small. The hymn sheet with the crease, the blank folded paper, the slightly misaligned latch, the rope fibers. The table shifted from its usual spot. And most telling of all, the church bulletin resting undisturbed by the door, exactly where she'd placed it the night before. But one thing remained unaccounted for: her journal. The notebook she kept in her purse was missing. It would not be found during the initial investigation, nor in the years that followed. It disappeared into the same silence that swallowed the truth of her final hour. This missing journal would become one of the earliest unresolved clues in what would later be recognized as the Parish Man pattern, a detail that hinted at someone who wanted not just control, but understanding of the lives he disrupted. And though investigators did not know it at the time, something else lingered unnoticed in the house, something small enough to be overlooked until decades later, when a computer in a church storage room hummed back to life and revealed a connection no one had thought to search for. The first weeks after Marla's death were marked by urgency. Officers moved quickly, interviewing neighbors, pulling fingerprints, mapping the faint impressions left on the carpet. The co-op staff submitted statements. Members of the choir came forward with recollections, and residents of Havenwick offered whatever they knew, even if what they knew amounted to little more than fear dressed as rumor. The investigation was thorough, but the first obstacle appeared almost immediately. There was no clear suspect. The back door latch showed only minor misalignment, not enough to suggest forced entry by someone strong or panicked. It hinted at someone familiar with the house, someone who knew how to manipulate the weak point in the frame. Officers interviewed repairmen, church volunteers, and neighbors who occasionally helped Marla with small tasks. None stood out. Nobody had a reason to harm her, and nobody could explain the faint rope fibers found along the hallway carpet. Forensic limitations of the mid-1980s meant the fibers were cataloged, photographed, sealed, and stored with the hope that future technology might make better sense of them. The blank folded paper found beneath the chair near the front door was preserved as well. Though without writing, fingerprints, or context, it was little more than a curiosity. It did not appear to belong to Marla, but there was no evidence that it belonged to the offender either. In the second month, a visitor to Havenwick became the first serious suspect. He was a drifter, seen buying coffee at the diner on the night of the murder. A waitress remembered him asking for directions to the county line. Someone else thought they saw him walking past Marla's street. Officers tracked him down, searched his belongings, and questioned him for hours. The man appeared confused by the attention. He had receipts placing him in a truck stop 50 miles away when the neighbor heard the flickering porch light. He was released quietly, though rumors lingered for months. Another lead surfaced through the church. A choir member reported seeing a stranger near the back of the fellowship hall during practice a few weeks before the murder. The man hadn't spoken to anyone, just stood watching before leaving abruptly. The description was vague: average height, brown jacket, nervous demeanor. A composite sketch circulated briefly, but nobody recognized the face. Some wondered whether the witness had misinterpreted a late visitor or someone waiting for a family member. Without evidence, the trail evaporated. By the end of the first year, the investigation had settled into a frustrating routine. Detectives revisited the fibers, the displaced furniture, the missing journal. Nothing changed. They sent samples to the state lab, but the lab's workload delayed results for months. When results did return, they offered nothing. No usable prints, no signatures in the rope fibers, no biological trace that could be identified. It was as if the killer had moved through the house wearing gloves, avoiding mistakes, anticipating every step investigators would eventually take. Interviews continued. Officers questioned former boyfriends, quiet men who lived alone on the outskirts of town, disgruntled co-op clients, and anyone known to have disputes in the past. Every trail hit the same wall: alibis, lack of motive, or total absence of connection. Havenwick was small, but not small enough for investigators to see every corner clearly. Some residents kept to themselves, some had secrets unrelated to violence, and some simply preferred silence. When a second woman in a neighboring county was found bound and murdered under similarly subtle conditions, eyes turned briefly toward Havenwick. The counties coordinated, shared notes, and compared reports. The similarities were undeniable. The rope fibers were nearly identical. The pattern of entering through a back door was consistent. But the second victim had a complicated personal history, including a former partner with a record of breaking and entering. He became the primary suspect, then the only suspect, until lack of conclusive evidence forced prosecutors to let the case waver in uncertainty. Eventually, investigators decided the cases were possibly linked but unconfirmed. The phrase became a quiet place to store doubt. By the early 90s, 2 more murders followed the same pattern. Each scene was quiet, controlled, methodical. Each victim lived a life embedded within the community. And each investigation ended with the same exhaustion: scattered evidence, blank spaces where certainty should have been, and a growing unease that the killer understood this place far better than those trying to catch him. Within the department, officers debated theories late into the night. One detective insisted the killer must be an outsider, someone drifting town to town. Another argued that only a local could anticipate the routines, know the short walkways between houses, or slip through poorly lit backyards without triggering suspicion. A third believed the killer was someone religious, given the peculiar calm at each scene. None of the theories produced a name. Marla Kinsey continued showing up at the station every few months. Sometimes he brought new questions, sometimes he brought nothing but the hope that something had changed. His conversations with officers were respectful, but a hard edge grew over time. He asked why the rope fibers couldn't be traced, why the missing journal hadn't turned up, why the folded paper wasn't being examined under new techniques. Detectives assured him they were doing everything possible, but he saw the fatigue in their faces. Local newspapers began to lose interest. The headlines grew smaller. Initial fear gave way to resignation. Havenwick residents left porch lights on longer, installed extra locks, and checked windows twice before bed. But with each passing year, the sense of danger faded. A new grocery store opened, then a new school wing, then a park. Life crept forward, and the memory of Marla's death softened at the surface even as it remained sharp for those closest to her. When the 3rd anniversary passed, a reporter asked the lead investigator whether he believed the case would ever be solved. He hesitated before answering. "We're not giving up," he said. It was true at the time, but even he knew that energy couldn't be sustained forever. By 1994, with no new evidence and no clear suspect, the Parish Man cases were quietly absorbed into a broader cold case initiative. Boxes of evidence were transferred to a basement archive, labeled carefully, but stored in dim aisles that smelled of dust and glue. A young officer once asked why the cases were named after a church reference, and an older detective simply shrugged. "Because that's what he wanted," he said. "He sent those letters. He picked the name." Eli was given a brief meeting when the transition occurred. An officer explained that lack of new leads meant resources would shift elsewhere, though the cases would be reopened if anything surfaced. Eli stared at the table for a long moment before speaking. "You're telling me you're stopping," he said. "We're pausing," the officer replied. "Doesn't feel like pausing," the officer didn't argue. There were no words left that could soften closure disguised as procedural necessity. Years drifted by. Officers retired, moved to new counties, left law enforcement entirely. Their replacements inherited boxes they didn't have time to revisit. The rope fibers aged in their envelopes. The folded paper remained sealed and meaningless. The missing journal became a footnote. The latch marks on the back door were forgotten. Every detail that once felt urgent lost its weight as time spread over it like dust. In 1998, a new detective sifted through the Parish Man files during a departmental reorganization. He lingered on the photographs, the handwritten notes, the early interview transcripts. He noticed recurring patterns, timing, access, familiarity. But without new evidence, he couldn't push the case forward. He closed the folder gently and placed it back on the shelf. "Wish I could do more," he whispered. By the early 2000s, only Eli kept the memory alive. He visited his sister's grave often and kept the old shoebox of clippings beneath his bed. Sometimes he brought new articles he found in distant newspapers, cases that resembled Marla's in rhythm, if not detail. He carried them to the station, but officers humored him with sympathy, not action. The science hadn't caught up yet. The evidence wasn't strong enough. There was nothing to compare DNA to. There was nothing to process digitally. There was nothing they could do. Havenwick moved on. New families arrived. Old houses were renovated. The church choir changed members, losing the warm alto voice that once filled its harmonies. Marla became a name spoken in low tones by those who remembered, but unknown to those who didn't. And somewhere in the archives, beneath a flickering fluorescent bulb, the Parish Man files rested in a row of silent boxes. Their labels faded, their contents settled. The truth inside them waited without promise. The final note in the case summary from that era was written in small handwriting. No further leads. Case remains inactive until new evidence emerges. It was the closest thing to despair an official report could allow. For years after Marla's death, time worked in uneven ways for the people who loved her. In Havenwick, the seasons turned as they always had, fields shifting from green to gold, the wind sharpening along the prairie, the church bells marking routines that no tragedy could silence. But for Eli Kinsey, time never moved cleanly forward. It looped, softened, sharpened, and returned to the same points no matter how far from them he tried to step. He kept her picture on a small table in his living room, the frame slightly crooked because he had bumped it once during a long night with too little sleep. The photo showed Marla smiling at a summer picnic, a paper plate in her hand, her hair pinned back with a simple clip. He dusted the frame weekly, though he didn't bother with most other decorations. Some objects demanded tending because they held weight others couldn't bear. In the first few years, Eli would wake before dawn on the anniversary of her death, drive to her house now sold to a young couple, and park across the street. He watched the porch light glow against the siding and imagined her still inside, humming while she prepared for another Sunday service. He always left before anyone noticed him. Grief, he found, was easiest when witnessed by no one. Their parents aged quickly after losing her. Their mother began writing long letters addressed to Marla, though she never mailed them. She kept them in a shoebox beside her bed. Sometimes Eli read them silently, sitting near the window while the afternoon light faded. The letters were filled with ordinary updates about the garden, small frustrations about the weather, and questions about holidays they wished they'd shared. As the years went on, the handwriting grew shaky, the lines shorter, the questions fewer. When she died, Eli found the shoebox neatly placed beside her will, as if she wanted him to continue holding the pieces she no longer could. The pictures of Marla in the family album started to curl at the edges. The colors softened into the muted tones of old paper. At gatherings, her name became a quiet presence mentioned in gentle, careful tones, then followed by a moment where everyone looked down at their plates. Over time, fewer people spoke her name at all. Not from forgetting, but from exhaustion. Havenwick changed in its own slow way. The grain co-op expanded with new equipment. The church replaced carpeting and repainted walls. New families moved in, and children grew up without ever hearing the name Parish Man. The town learned to live with the wound the way fields learn to. Regrow after a hard frost slowly, without flourish, carrying scars beneath the first green. Eli stayed. He worked as a mechanic, repairing tractors, combine harvesters, and the occasional old car that someone's father refused to give up. He carried on, because carrying on was what the town expected of him. But late at night, when the shop lights dimmed, he would sit on a folding chair and open a worn envelope that held copies of the earliest news clippings about Marla. The ink had blurred in some places. The paper was thin from being folded and unfolded too many times. But he kept reading them, as though repetition might offer clarity. He asked the sheriff's office for updates every few months. Sometimes they had a new rumor, sometimes a new technique they wanted to try, sometimes nothing at all. He learned to accept disappointment without showing it. Eventually the officers changed, new ones not yet familiar with the weight of the case. They listened politely, scanned old files, and gently repeated that without new evidence, there was little they could do. Technology evolved faster than the investigation. DNA testing improved, but the samples in Marla's case were minimal, degraded. Digital forensics became a field of its own, but nothing in her file seemed related to computers or devices. Every time the world advanced, Eli hoped her case would advance with it. Most of the time, it didn't. Around the 10th anniversary, a young journalist from Lincoln reached out to him for an anniversary piece. She sat with him in his kitchen, recording their conversation with a small silver recorder. Eli spoke carefully, choosing words that honored his sister's life rather than the violence that ended it. He told the journalist about Marla's morning routines, her affection for choir rehearsals, her worry that she wasn't good enough at harmonies. The article ran in a Sunday feature. It brought a pang of awareness back to Havenwick. A few older residents stopped by the diner afterward to share memories. But the renewed attention faded within a week. 15 years passed, then 20. The old co-op building replaced its cracked windows with new ones. The church installed brighter lights in the fellowship hall. Children who had once seen newspaper headlines tucked onto kitchen counters now grew into adults with their own families, their own troubles. The crime receded into the category of stories people remembered only when prompted. Eli noticed how the town balanced forgetting with remembering. Most days he preferred the forgetting. On rare nights, he wished everyone remembered clearly, painfully, completely. When their father died, Eli found himself alone in a house that felt too large. He packed boxes slowly, pausing when he found objects connected to Marla. A scarf she'd knit for their mother, a Christmas card she'd written years before, a paper star she had made for a childhood play. He put them in the same box as the clippings, as if proximity might keep them safe. As time moved into the late 2000s, Havenwick added new technology of its own. The library introduced computers. The co-op began using digital ledgers. The church replaced old equipment in the office, storing outdated machines in a closet that turned into a catch-all for objects nobody knew what to do with. During one particularly cold winter, Eli wandered into the station again, holding the shoebox under his arm. A young lieutenant listened to his story with empathy, but explained that the department's cold case budget couldn't support extended analysis. Eli nodded politely, though inside he felt an ache that had become familiar. As he left the station, he passed the row of archival shelves where he knew the Parish Man files sat. The boxes were identical to dozens of others. If he hadn't known which row to look at, he would never have recognized them. On a spring afternoon not long after that visit, an old friend from the co-op mailed him a photograph she had found while cleaning. The picture showed Marla smiling beside the grain elevator, holding a clipboard. The edges were bent, the image slightly faded, but it captured a moment Eli had forgotten. He studied it for a long time, then slipped it into the lid of the shoebox. The years continued to weave themselves into a shape that looked like acceptance from the outside, but felt like unfinished business on the inside. Eli aged. Lines deepened around his eyes. His hands stiffened from decades of mechanical work. But one thing remained unchanged. He kept believing there was something nobody had found yet. That belief flickered into something stronger the day he attended a small informational session in Lincoln, held by a visiting forensic analyst. The analyst spoke about advancements in digital evidence recovery, how even outdated devices could sometimes hold fragments of valuable data. He mentioned that old hard drives and thumb drives, thought useless for decades, could still offer clues if handled carefully. For most attendees, it was an interesting lecture. For Eli, it felt like a pulse of light beneath ash. He waited until the room emptied before speaking to the analyst. He explained, awkwardly at first, then with more conviction, that his sister's case had involved handwritten letters but no digital elements. The analyst suggested gently that any location connected to the routines around her life places she frequented, places run by the community, might have archived devices worth revisiting. Churches, co-ops, town offices, older administrative rooms. Eli drove home slowly, replaying those words. He knew the church Marla loved had remodeled twice in the decades since her death. He remembered seeing boxes of old supplies in storage areas when he'd gone there for events. He wondered if anything had been left untouched. For the first time in years, hope edged out despair. Not loudly, not dramatically, but as a quiet possibility in the back of his mind, something that asked to be followed. This small spark would eventually lead to the chain of events that brought Detective Rowan Hall to Havenwick, the pastor to the storage closet, and the old computer tower into the cold case lab. But on that night, alone in his living room with the shoebox open, and Marla's photo resting atop the pile, Eli felt only the faint stirring of something he had not experienced in decades. A reason to believe the story wasn't finished. Where are you watching from tonight? Drop an emoji in the comments. The cold case lab in Lincoln had grown quiet by the time Detective Rowan Hall arrived with the beige computer tower in his arms. Most staff had already gone home, leaving only the faint hum of climate control and the glow of monitors left running by analysts who preferred to return to their work at dawn. Hall placed the tower gently on a stainless steel table, brushing away the thin veil of dust that had settled across its surface. He didn't know yet what it contained, only that it had survived decades hidden behind stacked directories and broken office supplies. He filled out the intake form carefully. The pastor had said the computer came from a storage room untouched since the early 90s. The USB drive taped to the side was an unusual bonus, one that suggested the device might not have died quietly but had outlived its usefulness long before anyone noticed. Marilyn Yates, the lead digital forensics analyst, arrived moments later. She tied her hair back with a practiced motion, rolled her chair toward the evidence table, and examined the machine with the curiosity of someone who knew that the most unassuming objects sometimes held the loudest truths. "It's older than half the interns," she said quietly. "Can you work with it?" Holly asked. "That depends," she replied. "But if it has even one functioning sector left, we'll find something." She began by removing the screws from the tower's back panel, easing it open with cautious pressure. Inside, dust clung to the metal frame like frost, but the components were still intact. She removed the hard drive and connected it to a write-blocked imaging device, designed to preserve data without altering its original structure. Lights blinked on the interface, then settled into a steady rhythm. The system began copying the drive bit by bit, bypassing corrupted clusters and salvaging whatever fragments remained readable. Holly watched quietly, knowing that impatience would add nothing to the process. After 20 minutes, the imaging software pulled up its first list of recoverable files. Old document extensions populated the screen, many labeled with vague or generic names. Yates clicked through directories long abandoned by the church staff who once used the machine: sermon notes, budget lists, outdated rosters, choir schedules from 1992. Then she found the hidden partition. It contained only 5 files. 4 were wrapped in unusual naming conventions: Draft 1, Draft 2, Parish Notes, Sermon Pattern. The 5th file was labeled Lent_PRIL93, Yates opened the first draft. The text filled the screen in stark monochrome. Holly leaned closer as he read the opening lines. I watch the flock from the quiet places. I listen when the others forget. His pulse tightened. The phrasing matched the earliest Parish Man letter almost exactly, down to the peculiar choice of verbs investigators had never released publicly. Yates clicked open the second draft, then the third. Each file displayed variations of the same tone: ominous, intimate, written by someone who believed himself not simply a predator, but an overseer, a watcher of people who trusted him. These were never mailed, she said. Drafts, Holly murmured. Practice pages. The timestamp metadata showed dates between April 1993 and August 1994. The years immediately following Marla's death. The final year investigators believed the Parish Man was active. Yates scrolled to the user profile responsible for modifying the documents. One name appeared repeatedly, embedded in the old system logs. H-Lens_admin. Even before they looked up his full history, Holly knew the name. He had seen it listed dozens of times in archived church directories. Harold Lentz, the longtime facilities manager at Christ Hope Fellowship. The man who fixed lights, carried keys, and knew the layout of the building better than anyone. Yates opened the file labeled Lent_APRIL93. The document was shorter than the others, but its contents were heavier. She spoke to me on Tuesday. Thanked me for fixing the choir loft light. They trust me. She trusts me. Holly read the line twice, cold spreading through him. Then he read the last sentence. They will never look at me twice. He felt the same uneasy sensation he had felt inside the church. The realization that the safety Marla believed in had been counterfeit. Yates resumed scanning the drive, pulling timestamps, extracting metadata, comparing phrasing to scanned images of the original Parish Man letters. Every match reinforced the truth. The drafts on the church computer predated the taunts received by investigators. No one but the killer could have written these earlier versions. While Yates continued her work, a separate technician examined the USB drive. Inside were more files, hidden directories, fragmentary drafts, and pattern analysis notes that appeared to be early templates for what would become the killer's ritualistic language. When the technician clicked open another hidden file, a set of embedded system logs displayed login schedules. Most were tied to church administrative work, but the ones linked to the draft letters aligned perfectly with Harold Lentz's known volunteer shifts. The digital evidence was forming a shape. Hiley stepped into the hallway to call the DNA lab. They still had the degraded stamp adhesive from the envelopes sent in 1988 and 1992. For decades, the samples had been too faint to test fully, but new processing methods had recently strengthened recovery rates for old biological traces. He requested immediate retesting. 2 days later, the results returned. The partial DNA recovered was not enough to identify a specific individual, but it was strong enough to compare against potential familial samples. The system flagged a near match with a profile recently uploaded from a court-ordered database. The DNA of Harold Lentz's adult son, collected in an unrelated legal matter. The pattern snapped into place with clinical precision. At that moment, the digital trace and biological evidence aligned in a way the case had never achieved before. Holly drove to Havenwick before sunrise. The sky was pale and empty, just beginning to glow along the horizon. He parked outside the small diner where he had first spoken with the pastor. People inside were unaware that the town's longest unanswered question was hours from resolution. He walked to Eli's house. The porch light flickered, the same way Marla's had done decades earlier. When Eli opened the door, Holly could see the fatigue that time had woven into his face, but also the strength that had never left him. "We found something," Holly said softly. Eli steadied himself, gripping the edge of the doorframe. "Is it real?" "It's real. And it's strong." They sat at the kitchen table where so many unanswered questions had lingered. Holly explained the computer, the drafts, the logs, the dates, and the DNA. With each sentence, Eli's expression shifted, not toward relief exactly, but toward something deeper. Recognition, vindication, a breaking open of space that had been locked inside him for decades. He knew her, Eli whispered. She talked to him. Yes, Holly said. He hid in plain sight. When the state prepared the warrant, reporters caught wind of the developments. Nobody spoke the suspect's name publicly at first. Havenwick held its breath. People whispered in church parking lots, asked questions at gas stations, watched patrol cars pass without knowing the full weight of what was coming. That weekend, investigators retrieved the old church maintenance logs. Handwriting analysts compared them again to the original Parish Man letters. The matches were undeniable, the narrow spacing, the angled T's, the pressure marks where the pen dug into the page. For the first time since 1986, the case no longer felt like an unsolved shadow. It had form, it had direction, it had a name. As the sun climbed over the prairie, Holly stood at the edge of Havenwick's grain elevator lot, watching workers begin their day. The town was waking up to the truth, though most didn't yet know it. Soon they would. He thought of Marla, of the journal that had never resurfaced, of the folded paper left under her chair, of the years of silence, and of the old computer, an object nearly discarded, carrying within it the words that would break the longest quiet the town had ever known. Justice was no longer an idea. It was moving. Hit the like button if you believe justice always finds its way. The morning they arrested Harold Lentz began without ceremony. Dawn came slowly over Havenwick, pushing a pale ribbon of light across the edges of rooftops and the long spine of the grain elevators. Workers were already beginning their day when the unmarked vehicles approached the quiet street where Harold had lived for more than 20 years. His lawn was neatly trimmed, the porch swept clean, the house indistinguishable from those around it. For decades, nothing about the place had suggested danger. That was the unsettling truth at the heart of the case. Detective Rowan Holly stepped out first. He was joined by 2 state officers and a deputy from the county. No neighbors were outside yet. A dog barked somewhere down the block. The wind carried the smell of cold soil and old leaves. When Holly walked up the driveway, he felt the weight of the moment settle in his chest. Not triumph, not relief, but a solemn acknowledgement that the end of one silence was about to begin. Harold answered the door wearing a work sweater and holding a mug of coffee. He blinked in mild confusion at the sight of officers on his porch, as though expecting them to be delivering a notice about a vehicle left unlocked or a noise complaint from a neighbor. It took him a moment to understand the seriousness of their presence. Holly recognized the flicker in his eyes, a slight tightening that suggested calculation, then resignation. "Mr. Lentz," Holly said, keeping his voice steady, "we need you to come with us." Harold stared at him for a long second before placing the mug on a small side table near the door. He didn't ask what this was about. He didn't demand a reason or protest. He simply nodded once, as though he'd known this day might arrive, even if he never believed it would. When the cuffs clicked around his wrists, he closed his eyes briefly, a gesture that could have been acceptance or something darker. Word spread through Havenwick faster than it had in years. People stepped out onto porches, shielding their eyes from the morning sunlight as the convoy passed. Some recognized Harold immediately. Others only whispered guesses. A few stood frozen, trying to reconcile the familiar figure they'd known for decades with the possibility of something monstrous beneath the surface. At the station, Harold sat in an interview room with his hands folded neatly on the table. He didn't slouch or avert his gaze. When Holly entered with a folder of evidence, Harold lifted his chin slightly, acknowledging him with the same polite quietness he had shown for decades in church hallways and community events. Holly laid out the printed drafts from the recovered computer, the timestamp metadata, the login logs, and the DNA comparison results. He explained each connection carefully, not as an accusation but as a factual sequence. Harold listened in silence, his facial expression unreadable. After the presentation, Halle asked whether he had anything he wanted to say. For a moment, Harold remained still, his fingers interlaced. Then he spoke in a voice nearly identical to the tone preserved in the drafts, the letters, and the hidden lines investigators had spent years trying to interpret. "They were good people," he said softly. "That's why they trusted me." The room felt uncomfortably small. He didn't elaborate. He didn't confess in the full narrative sense. But what he offered was worse in a way, an admission of opportunity, manipulation, and the quiet arrogance that had shaped his crimes. Halle left the room with a heaviness he hadn't expected. Investigators had imagined anger or denial, but instead they found a calmness that chilled them more deeply than outrage would have. The trial began 6 months later. By then, media interest had grown beyond Havenwick. Reporters from Lincoln, Omaha, and even neighboring states arrived to cover what they called the cold case, thawing under modern technology. The courthouse filled early each morning with friends, relatives, and townspeople who had waited decades for answers. Some brought folded newspapers from the late 80s. Others came with nothing but memory. Inside the courtroom, sunlight filtered through tall windows, falling across wooden benches worn smooth by years of use. Harold appeared each day in a dark suit provided by his lawyer, sitting with the same composed posture he had maintained during his arrest. He rarely looked at the spectators, focusing instead on a fixed point along the far wall. The prosecution laid out its case piece by piece. They displayed images of the old church computer, the recovered drafts, the metadata logs showing times and dates that aligned with Harold's known schedule. They called digital analysts who explained how old hardware could preserve information long after it seemed broken or obsolete. They described the DNA partial match linking the stamp adhesive to Harold's son, the statistical reliability of familial comparison, and the corroborating timeline. When the handwriting expert testified, the courtroom listened with unusual stillness. The expert explained how certain traits, pressure marks, slanted characters, uneven spacing, were as distinctive as fingerprints. The comparison between Harold's old maintenance logs and the Parish Man letters was presented on large screens, each similarity circled in red. Even those without training could see the patterns. Harold's attorney argued that the digital evidence could have been tampered with or misinterpreted. He claimed that hardware that old was unreliable, that timestamps might be misaligned or corrupted. But the prosecution countered with the depth of cross-confirmation. Physical, digital, linguistic, and biological strands all pointing to the same individual. The argument weakened under the weight of accumulated proof. Eli attended every session. He sat quietly, sometimes gripping the edge of the bench, sometimes staring at the floor when images or statements felt too close to home. When the file Lent_April 9/3 was read aloud, when the line about Marla thanking her killer echoed through the courtroom, Eli closed his eyes. A woman beside him placed a hand on his shoulder. He didn't know her, but the gesture landed softly, a reminder that grief often finds its own small communities. During cross-examination, Harold remained composed. He neither admitted nor denied specific acts. Instead, he spoke in careful, detached phrases, often returning to the idea that he understood people's routines and felt a responsibility to watch over certain places. The courtroom absorbed these statements with a mix of confusion and horror. His language echoed the tone of the parish notes, revealing an unsettling consistency. The turning point came when the prosecution presented the alignment of the draft letters with the final mailed versions, phrases identical, errors repeated, transitions only someone refining their own writing would make. When asked whether anyone else had access to the church computer, Harold admitted he often stayed late to organize files and ensure the building was secure. The admission was subtle but significant. It confirmed his solitary access, undercutting any argument that someone else could have authored the drafts. After 5 weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for less than a day. When they returned, The courtroom rose in silence. The foreperson read the verdicts one by one. Guilty at all counts. The words hung in the air like a long exhale. Harold showed no reaction. He simply placed his hands on the table and nodded once, a small gesture that conveyed nothing of remorse or surprise. The judge delivered the sentence shortly after, multiple life terms without possibility of parole. In the bench behind the prosecution table, Eli lowered his head. For the first time in decades, he allowed himself to breathe without holding something back. It was not relief, not joy, but a release of tension carried across half a lifetime. As he stood to leave the courtroom, he thought of Marla's notebook still missing, of the church bulletin she had left by the door, of the lives she touched that were never quite the same without her. After the trial, residents gathered near the courthouse steps, speaking in quiet tones. Some expressed disbelief. Others felt a weight lift they hadn't realized they'd been carrying. Reporters asked Haile for a statement, but he declined. Justice, he believed, didn't need commentary. It needed steadiness. That night, as he drove through Havenwick, Haile passed the church where the investigation had begun again. Lights glowed through the stained glass, soft and unwavering. He pulled to the side of the road for a moment, letting the quiet of the town settle around him. The case was resolved in the legal sense, but its human impact was still unfolding. In his heart, he hoped the verdict had returned something valuable to the Kinsey family, a sense of truth reclaimed, a measure of peace, even if incomplete. He knew that justice rarely healed old wounds entirely, but it could offer clarity, and sometimes that was enough to let the living move forward. Haile started the engine again, the road stretching ahead beneath a sky filled with faint stars. Havenwick at last could sleep without the shadow it had carried for so long. In the months after the verdict, Havenwick settled into a quieter kind of clarity. For the first time in decades, conversations about Marla no longer ended in the same heavy pause. People spoke of her with gentleness rather than fear, and the shadow that had stretched across the town's collective memory began to recede. It didn't disappear. Nothing that deep ever fully does. But it softened, allowing room for other things to grow where dread had once taken root. Eli found himself visiting her grave less out of duty and more out of companionship. He brought fresh flowers when the wind allowed, sometimes chrysanthemums, sometimes wildflowers he picked along the trail she used to walk. He still kept the shoebox beneath his bed, but he opened it less often. The clippings inside were no longer the only proof that her story mattered. The truth had been spoken aloud, acknowledged, and written into the official record. He felt in small ways that she had been returned to him. The church also changed. During renovations, the congregation chose to leave one wall of the old office unpainted after discovering faint pencil marks from past volunteers' old dates, initials, and reminders scribbled long ago. They framed that section instead of covering it, letting the past stand alongside the present. Nobody mentioned Harold there. It wasn't a place of erasing what happened, but of choosing what deserved to remain. Detective Rowan Halle returned to Havenwick once more months after the sentencing. He walked through the fellowship hall, now bright and newly carpeted, and paused at the storage room where the computer had been found. The room was orderly now, filled with labeled bins and neatly stacked supplies. Nothing remained of the pile that had once concealed the answer everyone needed, but he remembered the dust patterns, the fading label on the USB drive, the stunned look on Eli's face when the truth finally clicked into place. The symbolic weight of the computer lingered with him, not as a machine, but as a reminder of how easily truth can hide in ordinary places. Even discarded things carry memory. Even overlooked spaces hold stories waiting for the right hands to open them. Halle drove through town afterward, stopping briefly at the co-op where Marla had worked. The new manager greeted him and pointed out that the desk Marla once used had been refinished and kept in the same corner. Workers still used it, unaware of the small role it had played in the story that shaped the town long before they arrived. The grain elevators loomed behind the building, steady as ever, catching the morning light. As he stood there, Holly felt a quiet hopefulness. Cold cases rarely offered the kind of closure this one had, an ending grounded not in miracle, but in persistence, community, and the slow push of science widening the cracks in old uncertainty. What began with silence and shadows ended with evidence speaking louder than memory alone. Ely later told him that on the night of the sentencing, he placed a small USB drive, an unused one he'd bought at the hardware store, on Marla's grave. It wasn't the original, of course, but a symbol of the truth that had finally surfaced. The idea that hidden things can come back to light if someone keeps asking the right questions. He left it there overnight. By morning, dew had settled across it, glinting faintly in the rising sun. Havenwick continued forward. Children rode bicycles past the church, new voices filled the choir loft, and porch lights flickered on each evening out of habit rather than fear. The town didn't forget what had happened. It learned how to live beside it. Justice didn't erase the past, but it steadied the future. And somewhere in the state lab, the old beige computer sat, tagged and archived. No longer a mystery, simply an artifact of a story that had finally found its end. Which case should we tell next? Leave your suggestion below.